So I have two wines for you. We tried with most to have an older wine and a younger wine, just because we all have histories. And speaking of histories, perhaps you'd like, see, that's me looking good now. Those are the flights we're going to have. And first flight, of course, is me. Speaking of histories, that's what I looked like when I started the wine business. And it's actually, I started the wine business maybe without knowing I was starting the wine business much earlier than that. I'm here because of one bottle of wine, which was a 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape. And it was sort of the wine that inspired my family to get into wine. So these first two wines I have are not 45 Chateauneuf de Pape, but one of them is a 2002 Monte Rosso, one of the great vineyards of California, 1,400 feet in elevation. The other one is one of the great vineyards of California. It's Old Hill Ranch. It's a mixed vineyard. Monte Rosso is almost 100% Zinfandel. Old Hill Ranch is probably 75% Zinfandel and 20 other grape varieties. It's a vineyard that goes way back to the 1860s and was replanted in 1885, so one of the first vineyards put on rootstock in California. Both made the same way. My winemaking is very simple. Both these wines were made in small open-top fermenters. The first one was actually made in a redwood fermenter. The second one was made in a stainless steel fermenter. Punched down by hand, native yeast fermentations, native mallows, and about 30% new French oak. So my winemaking, per se, hasn't changed much. The way I view winemaking, I don't believe has changed much, but I'm 40 years older than when I started. So like, the subtleties of not being able to actually see what has changed is there. So there may be subtle changes in my winemaking, but pretty much the same. So it's really what I believe to be good core winemaking. And that stems back to that 45 Chateauneuf de Pape. So my mother was a nuclear chemist who got bored when I was born. My parents met at a chemical honor society meeting. The chemistry was good, and I was the result. And my mother stayed home with me. And she got incredibly bored, so she decided to learn to cook. And in learning to cook, she read that the French drank wine with their meals. She'd grown up on a farm in Bolinas and had never had a bottle of wine in her life. But being my mother, she went to the city of Paris here in San Francisco and found a bottle of wine to go with Thanksgiving. The guy gave her a bottle of 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape. If he'd given her 44 or 43 or 46, I wouldn't be here today. But 45 was like the great vintage of France. And that bottle kind of turned my parents into wine drinkers. My father ultimately started a wine club. He taught me how to taste wine really early, when I was about 10. So I developed a love of wine very early. I, of course, was kind of the lost child for a long time. Ultimately ended up in medical research. But I ran into a guy named Joseph Swan at a tasting, and he and I hit it off. He said, you know, I need some help in my winery. Maybe you'd like to come up and help me on the weekends. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So basically, I spent my weekends and vacations from 1972 to 1976 with Joe Swan, learning winemaking. His consultant and best friend was Andrei Chelichev. So I really got the tutelage of a lot of really good people. Made my first wines in 1976, made a whopping 327 cases of wine, pretty much like I made this wine. My first wines were vineyard designated wines. I started making Zinfandel, one, because I tasted some samples that were like unbelievable. Joe Swan's 1968 is memorable to this day. It's unbelievable wine. And I've tasted others that were quite good. But Zinfandel fascinated me because it was the most European grape in California. It was the only grape in California that had the same tradition that European grapes have. So if you go to Bordeaux, what do they grow? They grow Cabernet. If you go to Burgundy, what do they grow? They grow Pinot Noir. Why do they grow those? Because over a period of time, through trial and error, they found those were the best grapes to grow in those particular regions. And they codified it. We didn't codify it. But Zinfandel arrived in California with a bunch of other grapes and really rose to the top. And by Prohibition times, it was the dominant grape in California. By the 1880s, it was the dominant grape in California. So Zinfandel ended up being planted in lots of places. Some of those places weren't particularly good, but some of them were wonderful. So Zinfandel from old vines gets planted in really remarkable places. So you end up having the sense of terroir in Zinfandel, the same kind of sense of terroir that you have in Burgundy or Bordeaux. Grapes planted in the right place, reflecting the flavors of that place. So for me, that was really important, and that's what in part drew me to Zinfandel, other than the fact that it tasted really good. I kind of lived a long and interesting existence. You know, I worked 2 jobs for a long time. Really, it was a seat-of-the-pants startup. Ultimately, I ran into some great partners in 1979 who were really smarter than I was. But they had the good sense to just let me do what I wanted to do. And you know, we ultimately ended up coming up with things like No Wimpy Wines. We ended up getting a great logo from David Goines. All those things were really, really helpful. And we went through the 90s. By 1992, I was actually getting a salary. I could pretty much devote myself to the whole operation. But the 90s were like chaos. It was like things were just growing like mad. In 1983, I started a little thing called Vintners Blend Zinfandel, which at one point was probably the most consumed Zinfandel in the entire world. But I was working at Vinwood, and I was working at Louis Martini. I took over 2/3 of Louis Martini at one point to make a Vintners Blend. Plus, we were doing all this work in in redwood fermenters, you know, making our single vineyard wines. When we released the single vineyards, we'd have people lined up out the door for the release. It was quite amazing. It was like a really energized time for making wine. Slipped into the 2000s, and in 1999, my partners, who had gotten pretty old, had decided that it was time to get out. So they decided we'd go public. And I was actually a public winery from 1999 to 2001. And then in 2001, we got acquired by Constellation. We almost got acquired by Robert Mondavi. That was pretty good we got acquired by Constellation, because they later acquired Robert Mondavi, so we would have ended up there sooner or later. Anyway, so, you know, Constellation, wow, big organization. It is a big organization, but it's been really interesting. I've gotten to do things that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to do. I've gotten to travel the world. I've gotten to proselytize for Zin in exotic places like Kuala Lumpur and Stockholm. Would you call that Stockholm Syndrome? Maybe. And I've gotten to make the wines that we want to make, and it's been pretty interesting. I am currently beginning a new project. I'm still doing Constellation, of course, and still doing Ravenswood. But I'm looking down the road. I'm 70 years old. I'm not quite as young as I used to be. And I decided that I'm going to start another little project called Once and Future. So once I had a little winery, in the future I'm going to have a little winery. So you can find those wines online. But it's, this is not working very well.
I would say not.
Yeah.
You have anything you want to talk about?
Yeah. I've only talked 8 minutes and 25 seconds, Doug. You've got 11. Anyway, it's been a remarkable era for me. It's been a remarkable era for the wines of Zinfandel. I have watched this business change from a very small business to, which wasn't really a business. It was really kind of like, you're making wines because you love to make wines, and you sell them if you can. And you know, there were no big Costco wasn't around, and you know Safeway wasn't around, and you know, so we all kind of made it by selling wines to people and to independents and to restaurants. It was very, very interesting back in those days, and we're all kind of lucky to be here, I think. And to see the kind of the modern era with the bigger wineries and intermingled with little wineries, and see the divide between the artisanal wineries of the world and the larger wineries of the world, you know, the consumer-driven wines of the world versus, you know, the winemaker-driven wines of the world. Very interesting to watch that. And it's unknown to me how that will all evolve at the end of the day. But there's no question that because Zinfandel is what it is, because it's kind of the wine of California, because it's the wine of terroir, it will have a place in that spectrum, in spite of the fact that we have the latest fancy grape, Pinot Noir, or Cabernet, or whatever it may be. Zinfandel will always be part of that.